Fidel Castro. That name used to strike fear in the US, and his country of Cuba stood strong against the United States. But nowadays he has been reduced to nothing less than a figurehead to sell banana-flavored soda. Well, in the 1950s and 60s, he scared the US so much that the CIA decided he needed to die. Thanks to the declassified Kennedy assassination documents, we will get to take a peek at what they were doing. Now, there are tens of thousands of documents within this collection, so I've not been able to read them all, but what I have found is strange, bizarre, and outright horrifying. I will mainly be focusing on the 1967 Inspector General's report on the plots to assassinate Fidel Castro and the 1975 Church Committee's alleged assassination plots involving foreign leaders, as these are large official documents that draw from tons of smaller sources like memos and stuff. So I thought it would be better just to see the collected information rather than hunting down all the general details. It is also interesting as I get to see the CIA's perspective on what they did and Congress's version of what they want to report happened. I will be drawing on other documents like memos and interviews as I see fit, as a lot of the fun, interesting stuff aren't in the official report, which makes sense that they might not want to say it. Cut. I will be drawing on other documents like memos and interviews as I see fit, as a lot of the really funny and wacky stuff aren't even in the official report, which makes sense as they might be seen as unnecessary. I will be drawing on the timeline listed in the documentation that accompanies William Harvey's interviews, as it spells everything out nicely. There are a lot of moving parts to this tale, so we may jump around chronologically just to follow specific threads. Now, before we get into the documents, I just want to say I find it hilarious that the official CIA term that they use for these plans is schemes. Like, of course they were schemes, not plans or ideas, but schemes. Nowadays, it just comes off as more sinister or evil to use that word. Some of this stuff started before Operation Mongoose, also known as the Cuban Project. The Cuban Project was the official operation sanctioned by JFK to topple Cuba and Castro. Just to clarify, the Church Committee, which was created in 1975 by Congress, was created to investigate the IRS, the NSA, the FBI, and the CIA for overreach. Now let's talk about the gambling syndicate scheme. It was by far probably the most convoluted one. I mean, just look at that. Everyone was implicated.
The gambling syndicate scheme started when Deputy Director Bissell met with Director of the Office of Security Edwards.
Bissell and Edwards met to discuss the need to find someone to deal with Castro through the gambling syndicate in Cuba. Now, Castro closed the casinos when he took power, only reopening them in February of 1959 for tourists. This hit the mob hard, so they wanted their revenge on Castro. Edwards appointed O'Connell as support chief to this whole operation. Edwards and O'Connell turned to Mayhew, an ex-FBI member and the one who had done tasks for the CIA before, to find underground contacts. Mayhew got in contact with Roselli, who had syndicate contacts. O'Connell and Mayhew both claim it was the other person's idea to involve Roselli, probably because neither one wanted to be directly responsible for what happened. Roselli was originally hesitant to join the scheme, but was after convinced that it was his civic duty to help America, to the point where he refused to accept any form of payment for his help, including reimbursements for travel or expenses. It also wouldn't hurt to have the US government owe you a favor if you're part of the mob. Roselli connects Mayhew and O'Connell to Sam Gold and Joe, two mobsters. Trafficante was actually the Cosa Nostra chieftain in Cuba, so he actually had decent power. Sometime between a month into the CIA and Mafia working together and a year, the exact dates aren't super confirmed. Mayhew contacts Florida private investigator Du Bois to bug a Las Vegas hotel room owned by Dan Rowan, part of a comedy trio. Gianciana suspected his mistress... Giancana suspected that his mistress, Phyllis McGuire, part of a notable Las Vegas singing group, was having an affair with Rowan. Du Bois then assigned the task to Belletti. Belletti proceeded to bug the telephone when he was supposed to put in a microphone to hear everything. Belletti left the hotel room after the bugging to go see Rowan's show, and a maid came in, found all the bugging equipment out in the open and running. She calls the police, who arrested Belletti. Belletti tried to call Du Bois, but couldn't reach him. Belletti then proceeded to, in front of the officers, call Mayhew, getting him directly involved. Mayhew talks to the local authorities, and Roselli pays Belletti's bail. The FBI starts investigating this case and was going to charge Belletti and Mayhew with various wiretapping crimes until Mayhew told the FBI to talk to Director of Security Edwards. Edwards tells the FBI to bugger off and that is part of one of his operations, that if the FBI was to continue their investigation, it would look poorly on America. Mayhew gave two different reasons for the bugging, one to the FBI and one to the CIA. He told the FBI that it was to see if Giancana was snitching on his mistress, but told the CIA, who approved the plan, that it was to see if she was having an affair, a you scratch my back, I scratch yours sort of situation. Now that connections were made, it was time to figure out how they were going to actually pull it off. The CIA originally thought that they would have mobsters roll up, gun down Castro, and drive away. That was deemed impractical by the mobsters as they could not find a single person willing to do such a mission, as it was deemed a suicide plan. The CIA then, without express approval, mind you, just started making stuff in the winter of 1960s. One of the first things they did was poison cigars. They took Castro's favorite cigar, dumped an insane amount of botulinum toxin in it, sealed it back up to give as a gift. 6 years later, one of the cigars was tested and found to still have 94% of the toxin. They were so deadly that it was fatal to even place it in your mouth for a second, let alone light one up. The cigars were never used and later destroyed in 1963 after Edwards retired. Things like this were paid for in secret, just by having someone high up tell the bookkeepers that the money was spent on important stuff and it was green stamped. Little to no record exists of actual payments for these things, other than testimony about 5 to 10 years later. Some other plans that they thought of but didn't really go anywhere was pufferfish toxin in a pin and a handkerchief with bacteria. Eventually, they settled on liquid poison, which would work as Castro frequently drank tea and coffee. A few months later, this was changed to a solid form of poison, as that would be easier to transport. The goal was to have something that was safe to handle, dissolved in liquid, needed time to work so the assassin could get away, and had consistent, repeatable results. Traficante got in contact with Juan Orta, a Cuban official that had a bone to pick with Castro. When the first round of pills were made, Edwards stuck them in a glass of water. They failed to dissolve, so they were sent back. Edwards additionally contacted a doctor friend to test how lethal the pills were. Doctor tested them on guinea pigs upon Edwards' orders and payment, and the pills were ineffective. Edwards raised hell with the man who made the pills, who then explained that the guinea pigs were resistant to the form of toxin used, and then ran tests on monkeys, proving they were toxic. Next round of pills were made, passed to O'Connell, who passed them to Roselli, who passed them to Traficante, who passed them to Orta. Orta held the pills for a few weeks before returning them, as he no longer held his position in office. Since Orta was out, Traficante turned to Verona, the head of the Democratic Revolutionary Front. Verona was interested as the CIA told him they'd be willing to pay for the job. Roselli gave tens of thousands of dollars and the pills to Verona. Verona had a contact in a restaurant Castro liked, so the plan was to poison him there. In the corner here is William Harvey, who's looped in on everything but doesn't play a part till later. After the failed Bay of Pigs operation in April 1961, this whole operation is put on pause. The pills were recovered by Roselli and destroyed. The Attorney General Robert Kennedy became aware of the wiretapping incident and demanded to be informed, so Edwards did on May 7, 1962. He flipped out, obviously, over the fact that the CIA was directly involving themselves with underground figures. He said, quote, "I trust that if you ever try to do business with organized crime again, with gangsters, you will let the Attorney General know before you do." Edwards responded by saying, "Yep, that was a reasonable request." Of course they didn't listen, which brings us to the next part. I hear what you're saying. 2 conspiracy boards? The production value of this video must be insane. To which I say yes. Yes, it is. The whole plan has been lying dormant for a while now, until William Harvey, who became in charge of the whole operation late 1961, reactivated it. William Harvey is an interesting figure. He created a program called ZR Rifle, which was supposed to be used to break into embassies to steal codes. But that was just the cover story. It was actually created to do executive action, which is just a fancy way of saying assassinations without actually saying it. There's a whole list of bad words that couldn't be said and their counterparts. You couldn't say assassinate or have that written down, so people would say deal with the Cuba problem, eliminate Castro, liquidate him, that sort of thing. Well, after Harvey created the general ability to assassinate leaders, he was transferred over to deal with Castro. Bissell told him to take over the gambling scheme and apply ZR rifle to Cuba, but only upon Bissell's retirement in February 1962, as he didn't want to be involved in it. Harvey proceeds to reactivate the scheme in early April 1962 and put that under his ZR rifle umbrella, a month before RFK says to tell him in advance. Edward contacts Harvey with Roselli, who reconnects with Verona. Verona gets a hold of the pills again, but requests explosives, guns, and other equipment. Harvey told Roselli to stay in contact with Verona, but to leave out Mayhew or Giancana, as Harvey thought they were more of a hindrance than a help. Verona gets a hold of the pills again, but requests explosive guns and other equipment to just help with the revolution. Harvey proceeds to hire a U-Haul truck and transport said guns, explosives, and equipment to Roselli, who brought them to Verona. Around July of 1963, Harvey cancels the plan as he does not see it going anywhere, thus ending the gambling syndicate scheme. In 1963, a specific task force was created by William Harvey called Task Force W, whose goal was to come up with ways to kill Castro. One plan they came up with that they thoroughly looked into for a while was an exploding seashell. Castro liked to scuba dive, so they thought if they found a fancy shell sure enough to attract Castro's eye and loaded it with explosives, then when he picked it up, it would kill him. The plan was canceled after they realized it would be incredibly impractical and that no native shell would be attractive enough for Castro. Another plan was to give Castro a contaminated diving suit by James Donovan, who's actively in negotiations with Castro for the US. A contaminated suit and gear was made, but not given to Castro, as Donovan gave Castro a completely different suit. The next major scheme was called Amlash. I'm not super certain on how it's supposed to be pronounced, as I've only ever seen it in writing. In March of 1961, a CIA officer met with Ronaldo Cubella, the second-ranking leader of the Directorio Revolucionariado, something like that, 13 de Mazzaro. It was a student-led group for violent revolt. Cubella expressed his dissatisfaction with the way Cuba was being led and how he wanted to lead a coup. In the process of said coup, Cubella thought it important, nay, necessary, to assassinate Castro. Cubella told the CIA that himself and Juan Orta wanted to defect to the US. The CIA convinced him to stay so they could work with him on the coup plans. The CIA picked Carlos Tepedito, codename AmWhip-1, a Cuban exile who knew Cubella before the revolution, to be the main point of contact. Tepedito and Cubella met several times in France, Denmark, and Sweden, away from the US and Cuba to discuss business. Over the next months, over several meetings, they discussed plans, but Cubella refused to use the word assassinate, to the point where he would get visibly upset and threaten to leave. He instead chose the word eliminate, like that's any better. Over the next year, there are numerous meetings with various case officers and Cubella, with nothing of particular to note about them, so I didn't feel necessary to mention each individual one, each individual case officer, other than just they happened. Eventually, Cubella wanted to meet with Robert Kennedy, the Attorney General, to get his personal agreement to protect Cubella if anything happens. Desmond Fitzgerald, Chief of Special Activities Section, met with Cubella to speak on RFK's behalf, without getting Robert Kennedy's permission to speak in his name. Fitzgerald explains that the US will military support any group that manages to kill Castro and lead a successful coup. As soon as they have the political power to request aid from the US, it would be supplied. Individual uprising would not get direct support, but once they were successful, the US would get involved to help. Cubella at the meeting kept demanding a high-powered scoped rifle to kill Castro, to which Fitzgerald initially said no, but after Cubella requested more guns, grenades, dynamite, and equipment so they could storm Castro's headquarters and radio stations, he agreed to supply several different caches while also requesting to everyone involved that as little as possible get written down about Amlash. The record gets dicey at this point, even to where CIA isn't certain exactly what happens when, so we're just going off of the interviews years after the fact. Kubela really wanted Castro gone, but refused to put his own life on the line to do it. The CIA then worked on a method of poisoning that it could be assumed Kubela could have come up with himself as to not draw suspicion from outside help. They decided on nicotine sulfate, which is relatively easy to get their hands on. Side note, when the Church Committee was making their report, the CIA heavily pushed to have the whole poison thing redacted, as they did not find it fitting to publish to the world readily available toxins. It got published uncensored despite pushback. They proceeded to put the hypodermic needle with the poison in a Papermate pen after around about 8 attempts to try to make this thing. On November 22nd, Sanchez, one of the case officers, arrives in Paris with the pen to meet with Kubela. Kubela, upon seeing the pen, was not impressed and asked if the CIA couldn't come up with anything more sophisticated than that. No one recalls exactly, but it is believed that Kubela threw out the pen. Upon exiting the meeting, both men were informed that President Kennedy was assassinated. Let me repeat that. As Kennedy was killed, the CIA was in the process of giving assassination tools to kill Castro. This loosely ends the Amlash scheme. There's some minor communications over the next year or so, but nothing of substance. From 1963 to 1965, we gave them various guns and silencers and equipment. It wasn't an immediate end to the operation once Kennedy was killed, but just gradually petered off. By 1965, the CIA officially called off all contact with Kubela's group, as it couldn't be trusted to keep their mouths shut. In March of 1966, Kubela and others are arrested in Cuba for counterintelligence acts involving the CIA. But during the trial, the only stuff that was mentioned was 1964 and later, so just meeting with the CIA, getting caches of weapons sent, no mention of the pen or anything. Kubela was sentenced to 25 years in prison for his crimes. The question arises if JFK knew about the assassination attempts, and the official answer is no, but various members of the CIA say that although Kennedy was not officially told, there's strong evidence he knew. For one, his brother was told of the gambling plot, and Bissell believes that Dulles, the man above him, briefed the president, although in very vague general terms, like we discussed earlier. There was a goal to keep plausible deniability from the president, but that didn't mean he had absolutely no idea about what was going on. The Church Committee, in their investigation, came to the conclusion that it is possible he had direct knowledge, but impossible to prove. Additionally, you need to think about their motive. Does anyone want to tarnish the memory of Kennedy by saying he knew and sanctioned assassination attempts on foreign leaders? Before the gambling syndicate scheme, they came up with different plans to negatively impact Castro without having to kill him. One plan involved waiting until Castro went on a specific trip, and when he placed his shoes outside his room to have them shined, then thallium powder would be placed that would lead him to lose his beard. They thought that if Castro lost his beard, then the Cuban population would lose faith in him. The powder was acquired and tested on animals, but that plan fell through when Castro did not go on that trip. Another plan was to pump the radio station that Castro broadcasted his live speeches in with chemicals that caused similar reactions to LSD, so he would start tripping balls during his speeches. The chemicals were not reliable, so that was a major reason this plan did not happen. So created adjacent to the plans to kill Castro was Operation Mongoose, the general plans to subvert and control Cuba. There was an operation that was made up of more than just the CIA, all facets of the government were involved. Harvey was the CIA representative involved in the operation. Some of the plans were hilarious, like trying to float balloons from Florida to Cuba with anti-Castro propaganda on them. These plans did not officially involve assassination, but they were still discussed. There's a memo from William Harvey in August of 1962 where he mentions a memo written after one of the Mongoose meetings included the phrase, including liquidation of leaders. To which Harvey freaked out, called up the dude who wrote the memo, and told him to remove all mention of that from all memos. Harvey was incredibly mad as at the meeting he told everyone not to make reference to that particular point at all. There was apparently also a completely different operation called Operation Judas by Cubans to kill Castro and overthrow the government. Now, from my understanding, this was something the CIA knew about, but didn't directly help. But it'd be hard to believe they didn't hope it would be a success. There were a bunch of other things like this where small groups would get in contact with the CIA and ask for weapons or money. The CIA would tell them if they're successful, then they'll get some support. Some interesting things came up when the Church Committee requested documents from the CIA. For example, many of the documents that discuss Cuba or assassinations are either missing or just labeled destroyed. Additionally, they had a conversation with the Attorney General about wiretapping a newsman, and that also got destroyed. That's just something I found interesting. Because all of the Kennedy files are getting released, we got to see the copies that are in the process of being edited for censorship, and randomly I found these doodles, which I just thought was hilarious. Just wanted to mention that. There was also a backup plan, codenamed Square Dance, a plan to demolish the Cuban economy by airdropping a sugarcane parasite to wipe out the crop. The Church Committee was appalled and stated, quote, Congress must drive home the point that there are legal and moral limits to the American foreign policy. These limits may not be easy to define, but we must try. During the church investigation, they also found a list titled Must Go List, made in 1960, which included names like Castro and Che Guevara. Richard Drain, who was the chief of operations at the time of making up the list, said, quote, he thought it might be interesting to try to keep Raul in, with Fidel out. Capture what magic there was in the name of Castro, but do it with that little homosexual instead of with Fidel, the real man. The CIA's official stance on what they did was that because nothing was ever officially stated about assassination and it was just said to deal with Cuba, that they may have gone a bit too far. Additionally, they were under extreme pressure to come up with solutions, so they can't really be blamed for what they did. But on the other hand, the official CIA history document about the Bay of Pigs invasion, Richard Drain, chief of operations during all this, had different thoughts. He was intentionally kept in the dark for things before the Bay of Pigs invasion. So when he inevitably heard about what the CIA did from the Church Committee, he was blown away. He said, quote, my thought when I saw this was, Jesus Christ, I must have been a little over-compartmented, because we had spent a considerable amount of nervous energy figuring out how we were going to get a shot at the old son of a bitch concurrent with the landing. He went on to discuss how he wouldn't have picked the mafia to do it, saying, quote, it is part of my job to ask, now wait a minute, what are we doing here? If this comes out, what will we look like? With the 50th year anniversary of the Church Commission occurring on November 20th, 2025, it is valuable to try to look back at our country's history so that we do not make the same mistakes or choices we did in the past. A lot of the major plot points and beats to the story were made public in the 1975 Church Committee report that both the CIA and President Gerald Ford pushed to suppress. If it was not for the strong wills of the Church Committee, much of this would not be known. As citizens of this country, it is important for us to be critical of the government as they are in our employ. By staying informed, we can try to prevent things like this from happening anymore.